starts the same way, more often than people realize. Not with a body, not with a suspect, and not with evidence. It starts with a decision, a working theory that becomes the theory, an interpretation that becomes the narrative, a direction that becomes very difficult to walk back. And from that point forward, everything that follows, every interview, every report, every conclusion either reinforces that path or gets pushed aside. Across this country, there are cases where investigations have gone wrong. That's not new, and it's not even controversial. What is harder to ignore is when the same types of problems start showing up again and again in different cases, in different jurisdictions, in different circumstances, but with the same underlying breakdowns. Scenes interpreted too quickly, forensics relied on too heavily or not carefully enough, statements shaped rather than collected. And once a narrative takes hold, everything else starts to orbit around it. This isn't about one case. It's not even about one outcome, because whether a case ends in a conviction or sits unresolved for years, or continues to raise questions long after it should have been settled, the foundation is always the same: the investigation. And when the foundation is flawed, even slightly, it doesn't just affect one decision, it affects everything that comes after. So the question isn't whether mistakes happen, because they do. The question is, when you start seeing the same types of investigative failures across multiple cases, at what point does it stop being coincidence and start looking like a pattern? Welcome back, listeners, to Dark Dialogue Distilled. I'm your host, John, and if you've been following along, we've been deep in the Holly Bobo case, working through the evidence, the timelines, the cell phone data, the decisions that shaped that investigation from the very beginning. And as I've been building that case out and starting to prepare for what's coming next with Lauren Agee, I started noticing something that just didn't sit right. At first, it was just a couple of things, small details, decisions that raised questions, but then it didn't stop there. As I've been digging into Brandon Embry's case, and as I look at Brooklyn Farthing's case, and even going back further, cases like the West Memphis 3, and then pulling from the research that I've been doing for my book on the Jeff Davis 8, the same types of issues keep coming up. Different victims, different circumstances, different jurisdictions, different outcomes, but similar breakdowns in how those investigations were handled. And that's when it stopped feeling like isolated problems and started looking like something that might be a pattern. Not from looking at one case, not from looking at two, but from spending a lot of time inside multiple cases across multiple jurisdictions and seeing the same pressure points show up again and again. Now, this episode isn't about proving anything. It's not about drawing final conclusions, and it's not about attacking any one place or any one agency. What it is a step back, a way to look at the investigative process itself and start asking whether some of the problems we're seeing in these cases might possibly be connected, because if they are, then it changes how we evaluate everything that comes next. Now, real quick, make sure that you're following the show so that you don't miss the next episodes as we move into Lauren Agee's case, continue building out Holly Bobo's case, and start looking into Brandon Embry's case. And if you want to support the work, you can do that through the website, Patreon, or Ko-fi. The links are in the show notes. All right, let's take a step back and start breaking this down. So what are investigations supposed to do? When we talk about investigations going wrong, we have to start with what it looks like when one goes right. Because if you don't define the standard first, then everything else just sounds like criticism. So let's take a step out of the Tennessee region for a minute And look at a case that we covered on the main show out of small town Michigan. In 2014, 14-year-old April Millsap went out for a run along the Macomb Orchard Trail, and she never came back. What followed wasn't perfect. No investigation is, but it is a strong example of what it looks like when investigators let the evidence drive the case instead of the other way around. Now, from the beginning, they did not lock into a single suspect. They didn't decide what happened and then go looking for proof of it. They opened the case up. Local law enforcement brought in state police brought in the FBI, and not because they couldn't handle it, but because more eyes, more resources, and more perspectives reduce the chances of missing something. They worked the scene carefully. This was not treated like a formality. It was treated like the foundation of the entire case, because that's exactly what it was. Documentation mattered. Details mattered. Small things like impressions, like positioning, like the condition of the body were preserved. They weren't rushed, because you only get one shot at that scene. After that, everything that you say about it is based on what you captured or what you missed. And then they started building, not guessing, not assuming, but building. They collected witness statements, people who had seen a man on a motorcycle in that area. They developed a composite sketch. They processed tips, hundreds of them. And most of those tips went nowhere. That's part of a real investigation. You don't just find the answer right away. You eliminate what isn't the answer over and over again until what's left starts to make sense. At the same time, they worked the digital side. April had a fitness tracking app on her phone. That data wasn't treated as a magic answer. It was treated like one piece of a much larger puzzle. Her movement was mapped, her timeline was reconstructed, and that timeline was cross-checked against everything else. Witnesses, locations, known activity, not just taken at face value, but verified. And then you have something like the shoe print, a detail that could have easily been missed or dismissed or overlooked altogether. Instead, it was recognized, preserved, and later used as a point of physical connection. That's the difference. Not one piece of evidence solving the case, but multiple pieces from different directions starting to converge on an answer. And that's really what a good investigation does. It doesn't rely on one thing. It builds layers, physical evidence, digital evidence, witness accounts, each one tested against the others, each one either holding up or falling apart, until eventually the picture that remains is the one that fits all of it. Now, this case did not have DNA tying everything together. It was largely circumstantial. And that matters because circumstantial does not mean weak. It means the case depends on how well those pieces fit together. And in this case, the structure held up in court and on appeal. And not because it was perfect, but because it was built carefully and deliberately and without locking in too early. And that's the standard, not perfection, but process. Because a good investigation is not about getting to an answer fast. It's about getting to the right answer and being able to show how you got there. And when that process starts to break down, that's when you begin to see the kinds of problems that we've been talking about. And so that's where we're going to go next. One of the earliest and most critical points of any investigation is how the scene is interpreted. Not just what's found, but what it's believed to mean, because there's a difference between observation and interpretation. Observation is what's physically there, the blood patterns, the positioning, the injuries, objects in the environment. Interpretation is the story that's built around those things. And when those two things get blurred too early, that's where the problems start, because once a scene is interpreted a certain way, everything that follows tends to support that interpretation. not always intentionally, but consistently. And that's where you start to see investigations narrow way before they should. So now let's bring this back to a couple of the cases that we've been working through. In Brandon Embry's case, the scene itself raises immediate questions. You're looking at multiple areas within that apartment: the bathroom, the mechanical closet, the bed, and the final body location. Each one tells part of the story, but the question is, were those areas treated as independent points of evidence, or were they interpreted early as part of a single fixed narrative? Because those are two very different approaches. If you treat them independently, then you're asking, what happened here? And then what happened next? And how do these pieces connect? But if a narrative forms too early, then those same areas start getting explained instead of examined. And once that shift happens, you're no longer reconstructing the event. You're reinforcing a version of it. The same type of issues start to come into focus when you look at Lauren Agee's case. Again, not getting into conclusions yet, but looking at the process. A scene that involves terrain, elevation, potential fall dynamics, body position. Those are complex environments. They require careful reconstruction because even the smallest details matter. Angles matter, distances matter, injury patterns matter. And if those elements aren't fully worked through, or if they're interpreted too quickly, you can end up with a conclusion that feels clean, but isn't fully supported by the underlying evidence. And so that's the risk. Not that investigators are ignoring evidence, but the interpretation starts to outpace verification. We've seen this kind of issue before. In Arkansas, in the case often referred to as the Boys on the Tracks case, early interpretations of the scene played a major role in shaping the direction of the investigation. Questions were raised later about whether that initial reading of the scene, what happened and how it happened, locked the case into a path that became difficult to challenge. Now, those cases are not identical, but the point of failure is very similar. When interpretation comes too early, it doesn't just influence the investigation, it defines it. And once that happens, everything starts to fall in line behind it. And when a scene is interpreted a certain way early on, the next place that influence shows up is in how evidence gets evaluated. And that's where things can get even more complicated. Let's take a case study, Brandon Embry, when the scene raises more questions than the conclusion. So when you take everything that we've just talked about, the difference between observation and interpretation, and how early assumptions can shape what comes next, this is where it starts to matter, because in Brandon Embry's case, the scene itself doesn't point in just one direction. It raises a lot of questions. You're looking at an apartment with multiple areas of activity: the bathroom, the bedroom, the mechanical closet, and the final position of the body. And each one of those spaces tells a part of the story, but not a simple one. There are indications of movement. There's indications of a struggle, changes in location that suggest that this wasn't a single isolated event in one spot. And then you look at the injuries, not just one injury, but multiple injuries, distributed all over the body, different areas of the body, different types of impact. And when you line that up against the condition of the apartment itself, the disruption, the damage, it starts to look less like a contained incident and more like something that moved, something that unfolded over time. Now, the question at that point should be, what happened here? Step by step. Where did it start? Where did it move? What do these areas tell us independently before we try to connect them? Because that is reconstruction. That's building the sequence from the evidence. But if a conclusion begins to form too early, if the assumption is made that this was a single event or self-inflicted or tied to impairment, then those same elements start getting interpreted differently. The injuries get explained instead of examined. The movement gets simplified instead of reconstructed. And the condition of the scene becomes background instead of evidence. And what you're left with is a version of events that may account for some of the details, but doesn't fully explain all of them. Now, to be clear, this isn't about declaring what happened in Brandon Embry's case. It's about process, because when a scene like this exists, with multiple locations, multiple injury points, and signs of disruption, the standard isn't to find the fastest explanation. It's to test every explanation against the totality of the evidence. And if parts of that evidence don't fit cleanly, that's not something to smooth over. It's something to dig into. Because once a scene gets interpreted in a way that simplifies the complexity of it, you're no longer working from the evidence. You're working around it. And this is exactly what happens when interpretation starts to take the place of reconstruction. Once a scene is interpreted a certain way, then the next place that influence shows up is in how the evidence itself gets evaluated. And this is where things can get very complicated, because forensic analysis, whether it's medical examination, injury interpretation, or cause and manner of death, is supposed to stand on its own. It's supposed to answer one question: what does the evidence show? Not what fits the theory. But in reality, forensic work doesn't happen in a vacuum. Medical examiners are given context. Investigators share what they believe happened. And sometimes, without anyone intending it, those two things start to align. Not because the evidence is being ignored, but because it's being interpreted through a lens that may already be forming. And when that happens, the line between independent analysis and narrative reinforcement can start to blur. Now, circling back around to Brandon Embry's case, the concern is not about one specific finding. It's about how the findings fit together. You're looking at injury patterns. You're looking at multiple areas within that apartment. You're looking at movement, positioning, and sequence. And the question becomes, do the medical conclusions stand independently of the scene, or do they align in a way that assumes a particular version of events? Because if that alignment happens too early, it can limit how alternative explanations are explored. Not shut them down completely, but narrow them. And once that narrowing starts, everything that follows tends to stay within those boundaries. Now, this is not a new concern. We've seen situations before where forensic conclusions themselves become a point of controversy. In Arkansas, during the tenure of medical examiner Dr. Fahmy Malik, a number of official determinations were later heavily criticized, and not just by families, but by other experts, for appearing to minimize or mischaracterize suspicious deaths. In cases like the deaths of Don Henry and Kevin Ives, the boys on the tracks, initial conclusions about cause and manner of death were later challenged as additional evidence and independent analysis came into play. And the issue there wasn't just the conclusion itself. It was the impact that that conclusion had on the direction of the investigation. Because once a cause of death is established, especially by an official source, it carries a lot of weight. It shapes how the case is worked, what gets prioritized, what gets questioned, and what doesn't. And if that conclusion is flawed or even just incomplete, it doesn't just affect one report, it affects the entire trajectory of the case. Now, to be clear, this does not require intent. It doesn't require misconduct. It doesn't require anyone actively trying to push a narrative. Is all it requires is alignment happening too early, where the interpretation of evidence begins to match the expectation of what happened before every possibility has been fully tested. And when that happens, the investigation doesn't stop, but it does start to move in a more defined direction. And once that direction starts to take shape, then the next step is where investigations can really begin to narrow. When a theory stops being just one possibility and it starts becoming the framework that everything else is measured against. I don't know that you could find a better case study of this example than the Boys on the Tracks case. When forensic interpretation starts to align with the narrative, this is what it can look like in practice. Now, in 1987, two teenage boys, Don Henry and Kevin Ives, were found dead on railroad tracks in Arkansas. From the beginning, the physical scene raised some serious questions. Their bodies showed signs of prior trauma. There were injuries that did not clearly match what you would expect from simply being struck by a train. There were indications that something had happened before they were ever placed on those tracks. But the initial determination was very straightforward. The ruling was that the boys had been under the influence, that they had smoked a significant amount of marijuana, up to 20 joints, and had become incapacitated and had ultimately fallen asleep on the tracks, got hit by the train. This was an accident. Now, once that determination is made, especially at the level of an official forensic ruling, it doesn't just sit in a report, it defines the entire case. It tells investigators what they're looking at. It tells prosecutors what they have, and it tells the public what happened. And from that point forward, everything begins to organize around that conclusion. The injuries are interpreted within that framework. The scene is understood through that lens, and inconsistencies become something to explain rather than something to challenge the conclusion itself. But as time went on, and as additional experts have reviewed the evidence, serious questions started to emerge. Questions about the injury patterns, questions about whether the boys could have been placed on the tracks after death or after incapacitation, questions about whether the initial toxicology interpretation and conclusions about impairment actually supported the scenario that had been presented. And as those questions grew, the original determination became harder to sustain because the issue wasn't just whether the boys had been hit by a train, because they had. The issue was what happened before that and whether the forensic conclusions had fully accounted for it. So now step back from the specifics. This is the risk when forensic interpretation becomes tied too closely to an early narrative, because once a cause and manner of death have been established, they don't just describe the evidence, they guide the investigation. They narrow the scope. They influence what gets pursued and what doesn't. And if that initial interpretation is incomplete, or if it leans too heavily in one direction, it can take a long time and a lot of effort to reopen those questions, if it's ever possible. And not because the evidence isn't there, but because the conclusion came first. And this is what happens when forensic interpretation starts to lead the investigation instead of standing apart from it. Now, at some point in every investigation, a theory starts to form. That isn't a problem. It has to happen. You need a working idea of what happened in order to test it, to decide what to look at next, who to talk to, what matters and what doesn't. A theory is a tool, but it's supposed to stay flexible. It's supposed to change when the evidence changes. It's supposed to get stronger or weaker depending on what holds up under pressure. The problem starts when the theory stops moving, not all at once, not as a conscious decision, but gradually. You've interpreted the scene. You've started aligning the evidence. The pieces are beginning to fit together. And at some point, that alignment starts to feel like confirmation, like you've got it. And once that happens, the role of the investigation begins to shift. It's no longer just testing possibilities. It starts to measure everything against that theory. New information comes in, and instead of asking, what does this tell us? The question becomes, how does this fit? And when something doesn't fit, it doesn't necessarily get ignored, but it does get explained, minimized, reinterpreted, or set aside for later. And not because anyone is trying to get it wrong, but because the investigation now has direction, and direction can become momentum. You start to see less attention given to alternative possibilities. Fewer resources are spent chasing leads that don't support the working theory, and more weight is given to the pieces that do. The investigation does not stop, but it stops being open. So now bringing this back to the cases that we've been working through, in the Holly Bobo case, one of the things that stands out isn't just what the theory was, it's how it evolved. Different suspects, different directions, different interpretations at different points in time. And the question becomes, at what point did that theory start to settle? At what point did it stop being one possibility among many and start becoming the framework that everything else was measured against? Because once that shift happens, it changes how the cases worked, not necessarily in obvious ways, but in subtle ones. What gets followed up on? What gets questioned? What gets taken at face value? We've seen this kind of dynamic play out in other cases as well. In Arkansas, again, in the West Memphis 3 case, investigators moved quickly towards a specific group of suspects early on in the process. And once that focus took hold, confessions, statements, and interpretations of evidence all began to center around that theory. Again, not getting into conclusions here, but looking at the process. Once a theory becomes established, especially in high-pressure cases, it becomes very difficult to step outside of that theory, because now it's not just an idea, it is the case. It's what's been presented. It's what's been built. And challenging it does not mean just asking a question. It means unraveling something that's already been put in place. Now, to be clear, this does not mean that the theory is wrong. It means the process of testing that theory may be compromised, because a strong investigation is not just about building a case. It's about continuously trying to break it. And when that stops happening, when the theory becomes something that gets protected instead of tested, that's when you start to see real problems develop. And once a theory takes hold like that, the hardest thing to do is go back and question it. So let's take a look at the West Memphis 3 case. Once a theory takes hold, this is what that can look like when it plays out. As you may know, in 1993, 3 young boys were found murdered in West Memphis, Arkansas. It was a horrific crime. High visibility, high pressure, a community demanding answers and wanting them fast. And very early in that investigation, attention began to focus on a specific group of individuals. Not because of physical evidence tying them directly to the scene, but because of who they were, what they wore. Teenagers, outsiders, associated, at least in perception, with the occult. And at that time, that really mattered, because this was happening in the middle of what's now widely referred to as the Satanic Panic era, a period where certain beliefs and fears were influencing how crimes were interpreted across the country. So When that early focus formed, it didn't exist in a vacuum. It aligned with something much bigger. And once that alignment happens, a theory can gain momentum very quickly. Now, from that point forward, the investigation begins to organize around that theory. Statements become more important if they support it, less reliable if they don't. Interviews take a different tone, not just gathering information, but trying to confirm what is already suspected. And in this case, one of the most significant pieces of evidence that emerged was a confession, but not a clean one. A confession that contained inconsistencies, a confession that changed, a confession that required details to be corrected or guided. And still, it became central because it fit the theory. At the same time, the lack of physical evidence directly tying the accused to the crime scene didn't stop the case from moving forward, because by that point, the theory wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was the case. And once a case reaches that point, challenging it becomes damn near impossible. And not because questions don't exist, but because the structure has already been built. The narrative has been established, the direction has been set, and reversing that doesn't just mean reconsidering one piece of evidence, it means reconsidering everything. Now, stepping back from the outcome and focusing on the process, this is what theory lock-in looks like. It doesn't require bad intentions. It doesn't require anyone deliberately ignoring the truth. All it requires is a theory forming early, aligning with external pressures or expectation, and then being reinforced over time. Because once that happens, the investigation doesn't just follow the evidence anymore. The evidence starts getting filtered through the theory. And this is what happens when a theory stops being tested and it starts being protected. Now, once a theory takes hold and once that theory has been reinforced through scene interpretation, through forensic conclusions, through the direction of the investigation itself, the hardest thing to do, like I've said, is to go back, because investigations do not naturally reset. They move forward, they build. And once a case reaches a certain point, whether that's a public conclusion or a closed investigation or a conviction, that direction becomes very difficult to change. And not because new questions don't exist, but because going back means more than just asking them. It means revisiting decisions that have already been made. It means re-examining conclusions that have already been presented. And in some cases, it means acknowledging that something earlier in the process may not have been fully resolved. That's not an easy thing for any system to do. There are practical realities. Time passes, evidence degrades, memories change, resources shift to new cases. And then there's something that's less visible, but every bit as important, and that is commitment. Because once investigators, agencies, or institutions have invested time, effort, and credibility into a particular version of events, there's a natural resistance to stepping outside of it. Not necessarily to protect it, but because it's what the case has become. So instead of starting over, what often happens is that the existing framework stays in place. New information gets worked into it if possible. And if it doesn't fit cleanly, it may get set aside or just left unresolved. And over time, those unresolved pieces don't always go away. They tend to linger. Questions that don't have clear answers, details that don't fully align, gaps that were never completely closed. Now, that doesn't mean every case is wrong, and it doesn't mean every investigation fails. But what it does mean is that not every investigation gets fully re-examined. And when you start to see multiple cases, different places, different circumstances, but very similar types of unanswered questions remaining over time, that's when it becomes harder to dismiss those issues as isolated. Because at that point, it's not just about what happened in one case. It's about how the system handles cases once they reach a conclusion. And when you take all of this together, the way scenes are interpreted, the way evidence is evaluated, the way theories take hold, and how difficult it is to revisit them, a broader picture starts to come into focus. When an investigation reaches a conclusion, this is where everything that we've talked about starts to matter the most, because once that conclusion is in place, going back, like we've said, becomes very difficult. And in Lauren Agee's case, that's where the questions begin to center. In 2015, Lauren Agee was found dead at a campsite during Wakefest at Center Hill Lake in Tennessee. The initial determination was that her death was accidental, that she'd fallen from a cliff. And on the surface, that provides a very clear explanation. But when you start looking at the details, the case becomes a lot more complicated. You're dealing with terrain, elevation, a fall scenario that should leave a very specific type of evidence, both at the scene and on the body. And the questions that have been raised over time don't focus on one single issue. They focus on whether everything that should have been examined was fully worked through. Questions about the scene itself. Was it processed in a way that fully captured what happened? Were distances, angles, and potential paths of movement carefully reconstructed? Questions about injuries. Do they align cleanly with a fall from this height? Or do they raise the possibility of something else happening before or after the fall? Questions about the timeline. Who saw what, when, and how consistent are those accounts when they're placed side by side? Now, none of those questions on their own necessarily change the conclusion, but taken together, they raise a much larger issue. Not just what happened, but whether the investigation was revisited as those questions began to surface. Because once a death is ruled an accident, the case moves in a very certain direction. Resources shift, focus narrows, the need for deeper reconstruction becomes much less urgent. And if additional concerns come up later, they don't always trigger a full reexamination. And not because they're ignored, but because the case has already been defined. And that's where the difficulty lies. Because going back doesn't just mean taking another look. It means reopening the possibility that the original interpretation may not have been complete. And that's a much heavier lift. Now, again, this isn't about declaring a different outcome in Lauren Agee's case, but it is about process. Because when a case reaches a conclusion and the questions continue to surface after, the real test isn't just how the investigation was conducted the first time. It's whether it's willing or able to be fully examined again. And this is what happens when an investigation reaches a conclusion and the questions come after it. So when you step back and you look at these cases, not individually, but side by side, a pattern starts to take shape. Not a conclusion, not a single answer, but a process. How a scene gets interpreted, how evidence starts to align, how a theory begins to form and eventually take hold. And then what happens after that? Because none of these issues on their own are enough to break a case. A misread detail, an incomplete interpretation, a theory that forms a little too early, those things happen. But when they start to stack, that's when they start to matter. That's when the direction of an investigation can begin to shift, not dramatically and not all at once, but gradually, until what started as one possible explanation becomes the explanation. And once that happens, going back becomes difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. Now, to be clear, this isn't about saying that any one case is definitely wrong. It's not about assigning intent. It's not about pointing at one agency or one place. And it's not about suggesting that these issues don't exist elsewhere, because they do. What this is is about recognizing a pattern in how investigations can break and asking whether that pattern is showing up often enough in enough cases to take a closer look. Because if it is, then it changes how we evaluate everything, including the cases that we've already been working through. There is still more to discuss in Holly Bobo's case, a lot more. That case isn't finished, but at the same time, if we stay too narrow, if we only look at one case in isolation, then we lose the ability to test what we're seeing. So this is where we widen the lens, not to move away from Holly, but to put that case into a broader context, to see if the same pressure points show up elsewhere, to see if the same types of questions come up again and again. And that's where we're going next. We're going to continue working through Holly's case here on Distilled, but we're also going to begin laying out the Lauren Agee case. And as we move through it, we're going to apply the same framework: scene interpretation, evidence alignment, theory development, and whether those conclusions hold up when you step back and test them. At the same time, across the network, we're going to be expanding into other cases as well. Some will be on the main show, some will be here on Distilled, some will be covered on both. Because this isn't something that gets answered in just one episode. It's something that has to be tested, case by case, decision by decision, process by process. So this episode is not a conclusion. It's a starting point, a framework. And from here on out, that's the lens that we're going to use. So that's where we're going to leave this one. Now, if you're following along, make sure that you subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, because this is going to build over time. And if you want to support the work, you can do that through the website, Patreon, Coffee. All of that helps keep these episodes coming and allows us to keep digging into cases like these the way that they deserve. So we're going to close this one out here. Again, I've been your host, John. I thank you for joining me. I appreciate you more than you could ever imagine. And we'll see you on the next one.